Hey there, this is Anthony from mycodeteacher.com, and in this lesson I'm going to show you how to create an application that consists of multiple XIB or NIB files. In other words, we're going to create an application that doesn't use only one interface builder file but uses one for each view that your application has. An easy trap to fall into in creating complex iPhone programs is to do everything in the default mainwindow.zib file. When your application is small and simple, you can get away with that because chances are you won't have too many views or too many interface objects that will cause memory problems. However, when you start creating really complex programs and you have tens or even hundreds of views, though unlikely, you will definitely run into memory problems, and it's definitely bad practice to do everything in mainwindow.zib for the simple fact that if you do everything in mainwindow.zib, all those those tens or hundreds of views will all be loaded at the start of the application, and you will very quickly run out of memory. So it's definitely good practice to split each view in your iPhone application into its own interface builder file. So I'm going to show you how to do that in this lesson. So let's get started. Of course, I've got Xcode open here, and I'm going to create a new project. We're going to choose window-based application, and we are going to title this multiple. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a navigation controller with nested view controllers, and each view controller is going to have its own interface builder file. So the first thing we want to do is, of course, open mainwindow.zib and add the navigation controller. So we'll do that now. So very simply, from the library, drag a navigation controller into the mainwindow.zib instances window and save. Now, the next step is going to require us to actually have already created a separate zip file for our root view controller. So here we're going to, in this little view box here, we're going to have our default or root view controller for this navigation controller. So basically the view that we want to show when the application first launches. As you can see here, if you go to the inspector window, of course if you don't have that open, you can go to Tools, Inspector. You can see here that if you select this view, there's a drop down here that says View Controller, and it has the title and the nib name. Now there is where you're going to want to put the nib name of the nib file or zip file that you want to be displayed, or that is that view controller. Now if we go to the identity inspector, here you have the class. Now we're going to be using our own custom view controller or a subclass of view controller, so we're going to fill that in. But first we need to actually create this class and this appropriate zip file. So let's do that. First we're going to create the view controller subclass. So for each view we're going to have a view controller subclass because the default UI view controller is not going to be specific enough for that particular view. So first we're going to go to File, New File. We have to select subclass of UI over here, UI view controller. And now there's an options checkbox here with zib for user interface. We're going to check that because we want a separate zip file for the interface. So we're going to click Next, and we're going to title this root view controller. Click Finish, and now we have here root view controller.h.m and .zib, the zip file for this root view controller. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open this root view controller.zib file, and we're going to create here what we want this to look like. Now, if we click on Files Owner, and you go to the Identity Inspector, of course if you don't have that open, Tools, Identity Inspector, you can see here that if you select Files Owner in the Instances window, it says that the class here is root view controller. That's important to notice. What that basically means is that this zip file is a root view controller, not that it is part of it or that it will be displayed in it, but it actually is it itself. So when we create or make an instance of this view controller, this root view controller, we're going to create it with this interface builder file. So it's going to use this interface builder file as itself, so to speak. And then, of course, again, that's very important to note because it's crucial with this whole process. And understanding that makes understanding this whole process much simpler. So in our root view, we want two buttons. One that when pressed will forward to one view, and the other when pressed will forward to a different view. So we're going to create those two buttons. So we're going to drag from the library onto the view window here. Push view 1, and the same thing, push view 2. Now another important thing to note is that if you check at this instances window here, that you see there's a view already been created. And now if we go back to files owner, which in this case is actually a root view controller instance itself, and we check out the connections, you can see that the view property of this root view controller, or the files owner, is connected to this view here. A view controller, if you don't already know, controls a view. It's basically responsible for managing or keeping control of a view. As you might imagine, this view is an accessible property of the view controller. So each view controller has a view that it controls, and that view can be accessed through the view property. So a view controller, or this root view controller, has a view property, and this view IB outlet is connected to this view that is highlighted in blue here. So whatever we put in this view window will be displayed when we get the display of this root view controller. So, in much simpler terms, whatever we put here will be displayed for the view controller, or the root view controller. So let's just center this horizontally and vertically. Now we're going to save this, and we're done with this file here. So we're going to go back to Xcode, and we're going to open back up the mainwindow.zip file. So now we're going to go back to what we were looking at before. So now, if you don't already have this open, double-click the navigation controller and click in this view here. Now here, if you go to the drop-down, we're going to choose root view controller as the zib, and you can see here it says view loaded from root view controller. So what that means is it's going to load from the root view controller.zip file, load that view, and display it in here as the root view for this navigation controller's root view controller. We need to also go to the identity inspector and change the class to root view controller. If you fail to do that, the application will actually crash at launch because it will load root view controller from root view controller.zib, but then it'll actually load it as a UI view controller, and there'll be basically a clashing going on, and things won't be in alignment, and the application will throw an exception and crash. So be sure to, when doing this loading process, to not only change the nib but the class of that nib or zip file. So now what we need to do is we need to actually add the navigation controller as a subview to the window. If we launch the application right now, it'll show a blank white screen, or the default window. We need to put this navigation controller in the window. So first we need to make an outlet here in the AppDelegate class and connect that outlet to the navigation controller that we created. We're going to call this main nav controller. Be sure to save. And now if we go back to Interface Builder, we can connect from the AppDelegate instance to the navigation controller that we created, connect the main nav outlet. Now we need to go to multiple appdelegate.m and add the navigation controller's view as a subview to the window. So window, add subview, main nav controller view. Again, note that a navigation controller itself is not actually a view, but it manages a view or contains a view, much like a UI view controller. In fact, it is a subclass of UI view controller. So when adding a subview to this window, we have to pass in the navigation controller's view, not the navigation controller itself. If we build the application now, we should have a navigation bar and 2 buttons. Now we need to make these buttons do something when pressed. So what we need to do now are create those other 2 view controllers that are going to be displayed when buttons 1 and 2, or push view 1 and push view 2, are pressed. So let's select the classes folder again and create those 2 other UI view controller subclasses. We'll call the first one view 1 controller, and we'll call the second one view 2 controller. So now let's open those zip files and add in something to differentiate. So we'll simply put labels here so as to make obvious which view we're currently in. We're going to do the same exact thing for view 2. Now we can actually make those buttons commit some action. So what we need to do now is we need to go back to rootviewcontroller.zip, and we need to connect these 2 buttons to some actions to the file's owner. But before we do that, we actually need to make these actions accessible through Interface Builder. So we need to go to rootviewcontroller.h and add 2 IB actions. The first one we'll call push view 1. The second one we'll call push view 2. If we save this now, we can go back to Interface Builder and connect these buttons to the appropriate actions. Again, we're going to connect to file's owner because file's owner is root view controller, and that's the class or object that we just created these 2 actions in. So now, when the push view 1 button is pressed, it'll send a message to its view controller, or file's owner here, root view controller, and tell it to commit the action push view 1. The same thing will happen for the second button, except it'll commit the action push view 2. Now we can actually make these do something. So now we're going to implement those 2 methods. IB action push view 1. First thing we're going to do is we're going to get that navigation controller that is currently controlling this root view controller. You can see here that a view controller has a property called navigation controller that is the navigation controller that it's currently nested in. So we can get that navigation controller simply by calling self.navigationController. Now that we have access to this navigation controller, we're going to push on view 1. But first, we need to make an instance of view controller 1, or view 1 controller. We need to first include the header file of view 1 controller, otherwise the application will it'll error as we try to build it. It'll say that it's never seen view 1 controller and doesn't know what view 1 controller is. So here we need to import view 1 controller. Now we can use it. View 1 controller, view 1 equals view 1 controller alloc init with nib name view 1 controller bundle nil. So what we've done here is we've created an instance of the view 1 controller using the init with nib name bundle method. So first we pass in the nib file that we want the view controller to initiate itself or instantiate itself with, which of course is view 1 controller. In other words, this view controller will make an instance of itself and it'll use the view 1 controller.zip file as itself. So here's where files owner comes into play. We pass in nil for the bundle, and by default the main bundle will be used. A bundle is basically an object that represents a bunch of files or resources that you can use for an application. The main bundle is of course all of these files here, so we're just going to keep everything there and use the main bundle. Now we can push in or push on the view 1 control instance that we've just created. So nav controller push view controller view 1 control view 1 animated, yes, of course we want the animation. And so now when the push view 1 action is committed or executed, the navigation controller will be told to push the view 1 instance that we just created with an animation effect. We're going to do the exact same thing for view 2. So we're going to copy this first line and just paste it in. But first, of course, we need to import view 2 controller. Now we can use it. Again, we're going to do the exact same thing, except we're going to replace all view 1 controllers with view 2 controller. Now we can launch the application and everything is going to work correctly. You can see that when pressing the push view 1 button, view 1 controller is created and pushed on, and when pressing the push view 2 button, the view 2 controller instance is created and pushed on. Now if you notice, when we press these buttons, we don't actually have any titles for the view 1 controller or view 2 controller, so we're going to add those now. So we need to go to view 1 controller.m and uncomment the override of the init with nib bundle method. Here we're going to set the title. So when we first make an instance of the view 1 controller, we're just going to set the title right away. Of course, navigation controllers display titles in their navigation bar based on the title of the currently displayed view controller. So the navigation controller, when displaying view 1 controller, will grab view 1 controller's title and display that in its title bar. We're going to do the exact same thing for view 2 controller. If we build this now, both view 1 controller and view 2 controller should have titles. There you can see. And of course the back button to the root view controller is added automatically. So you can see here that once you get the hang of using multiple zip files, it's really not that complicated, and it definitely keeps everything organized and most definitely conserves memory for your application. So it's definitely a great practice to get into, and I highly advise it. Well, this concludes this lesson. I'm Anthony from mycodeteacher.com. I hope you learned a lot, and I hope you tune into future lessons.